Welcome back to Your Town program in Monterey. My name is Carol McKibben, and I'm the director of a new Salinas history project. And my guests today are Mr. Sherwood Darrington, the managing director of the Agricultural Land Trust, and Mr. Pete Andreessen, a sixth-generation descendant, resident of Salinas.
Yes.
We're discussing Salinas history and Salinas past and present, really, because all of it connects and it's all relevant for how we understand this city today. It's an important city, a huge agricultural center, but also a community. And we left off last time at the moment when Salinas really became a community, which was at the end of the Progressive Era, at the end of World War I, when the financial support from San Francisco and the investments in agricultural development led to Salinas becoming a center, not just regionally, but in the state, and not just in the state, but nationally. So by the 1930s, Salinas has a very, very important agricultural center. It's building and expanding its city structures. There's a tremendous amount of infrastructure development going on in the 1920s. We see streets being paved and houses being built and theater. Salinas even had an opera house in those years. So when you think back into that era, I want you to talk to me a little bit about the era of the 30s, 40s, and 50s when you were growing up. What was Salinas like then? What do you remember? What was your fondest memory of the city?
Well, I think in that era that I look back upon is that I grew up on a ranch that was just outside of the city limits, and I went to a one-room school that was further out. And
that was in the 1940s.
That was in the late 40s.
Okay,
yes, right.
A one-room schoolhouse in the late 40s.
Yes.
All right.
and I moved from there into the high school, after graduating from the 8th grade. And that was a big change in my life because it was a big campus in comparison to where I came from. And I was felt welcome because there was all different different people there at that time, and everybody reacted with each other, and we all went to the parties at the same time, and football games and all of that time. So it was really a wonderful time.
It was a real community.
Yes.
And we were talking earlier about that we think in our modern era that multiculturalism and diversity is something new. Yeah. In fact, in California, that's the norm.
Oh, it was the norm.
California is the most diverse place in the country, and always has been. Always has been. And in the dim and distant past, which is what we're talking about today, that kind of communal way of life felt easier. It wasn't always easier, and it wasn't easy for everybody, but it felt easier because of the size. It was pretty small. And it had a lot of promise. We didn't know what was going to happen next in the 1930s and 40s. We didn't know what was to come. But it was a pretty small and tightly knit community in those years. And Mr. Andreessen, you grew up then too.
Yes, I grew up
You're not the same age. You're closer to my age.
Yes, I was born the year before you.
1954. I was born in 55.
And what I remember was I grew up around cattle ranches like you, and what I remember was incredible multiculturalism that to a child seemed kind of seamless. It never occurred to me it could be anything but incredibly multicultural. One of the amazing memories that I have that happened year after year was that we would ride our horses from the ranch to the rodeo, participate in the rodeo, and then stop for the Obon Festival at the Salinas Buddhist Temple and ride off with sushi in our saddlebags. Now, where else on earth does that happen? And I really grew up thinking that was normal.
Well, and in fact, not many places on Earth, because the Asian migration that you're referring to at the Obon Festival, the Japanese migration, the Chinese migration, the Filipino migration, those migrations that occurred in the period really late 19th century up until 1924, when the Johnson-Reed Act effectively cut off all migration from Asia, those migrations did not affect the rest of the country.
Right.
They affected California.
I didn't know
Hawaii
that until later.
and California. Pretty much that's all.
Right.
The West a little bit, but for the most part, this kind of diversity of population, and when we say that, we're referring primarily to various Asian groups, really happened in California only.
Right.
It really didn't happen elsewhere. So we grew up in this place, this idyllic place, and all of a sudden, and I don't want to really quite jump to 1984, but all of a sudden in the period between the 1930s, and even though what you're remembering is really idyllic, it was pretty hostile then in terms of labor relations.
Sure.
There was some dramatic strikes and repercussions that were in the impact of the strikes, and that's kind of what Salinas is known for. It's less well known for its urban development and the extent to which agriculture was so flexible and moved very easily into the next new thing. So when you think about the transitions, we talked about cattle ranching into a little bit into wheat, but then into the vegetables of the 20s that really made the place.
Absolutely.
When you were growing up, what was the main, what do you remember in terms of agriculture that you were both part of that?
Well, the main crop at that time, the money crop, was sugar beets.
You bet.
When I grew up,
Okay.
and lettuce. They were the competition between each other.
Mm-hmm.
There were still quite a bit of small white beans being grown, and some barley, particularly in the south part of the county. But around Salinas itself, it was primarily vegetable crops and the sugar beets being grown here.
So those were the big agricultural products.
Yes, those were big agriculture.
And who was developing those? Who was planting those? Because we talk about multi-cultural.
Well, it was
settlement.
Bruce Church. I worked for Bruce Church for part of a summer as a lettuce cutter, lettuce boxer, lettuce picker. Very, very hard work.
Yes.
And at that point, it was the transition. It was the 70s. It was a transition from the Filipinos were becoming less populous in the picking crews, and the Hispanics were becoming more populous. And it was very hard work. Sugar beets were on their way out because Spreckles was closing down, wasn't it? When did Spreckles close?
Oh, that would be in the 70s about.
Right.
When they,
So that's the transition and
Right.
the kind of cut off.
They pretty much
period.
stopped growing sugar beets when Spreckles closed.
Well, every group brought in some innovation.
Right.
And the Chinese are credited for bringing in what? What did they do that was important in the city?
Well, I think the Chinese, brought to California for the railroad development.
Exactly.
And
Then
then they
settled in
relocated,
Salinas,
and then some came to Salinas, and most of those people, as I recall, were involved in doing irrigation and stuff like that.
Land move,
Okay,
land
so
move.
new irrigation methods.
New
Right.
projects like that.
Right.
The Japanese, when they migrated in, they brought the strawberries with them.
And they knew how to
Yes.
grow them.
Mhm. And now the strawberries is one of the most major crops
Yeah.
that are produced here. Yes.
They also brought kind of an intensive agricultural technique. Whereas I worked on hay balers and the big sown crops, but the row crop, the intense row cropping, I think the Japanese farmers had a role in that. The other thing that I want to add, because it's kind of funny, is that Salinas, so far as I can tell, has always had a Chinese restaurant. Always, from the beginning.
Yes.
And
California is known for every little town.
Yes,
has
we
its Chinese.
have stories in my family of various interactions with Chinese restaurants and getting Chinese food. And so for Danish immigrants, because for a couple of generations they married Danish, So they'd come from the wife to be comes from Denmark,
Right.
and loves Chinese food. What do you think about Salinas, the Chinese food?
Wow.
So it's been a very multicultural place all along.
Well, and the exposure, and every group brings an innovation.
Right.
So I was thinking about that. I was thinking about the Japanese farmers who brought in new new irrigation techniques that allowed for the development of the strawberry industry, which we know now is global. It's huge. It's really significant. And Salinas was such a fertile environment that these crops were embraced, and we moved into the next one. So now we talk about Salinas as the salad bowl of the world, and we need to be mindful that everyone contributed to that.
Yes.
And to the development of this city.
Another interesting thing with the Japanese farmers that I found fascinating in my lifetime was that they really worked at the greenhouse flower industry a lot. And what's interesting was...
Okay, and the orchid industry?
Yeah, and that tended to migrate out. So it's really interesting as you see these technologies that are fostered here in the Salinas Valley spread out. Vegetable, for example, a lot of vegetables, places that when you and I were starting out, they wouldn't dream of growing a vegetable, and now there's vegetables all over California because of the techniques that were developed here.
So everyone contributed. It was a communal, lovely place. And then December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor.
Right.
Everything changed.
Yep.
Everything changed. And what a lot of people don't realize, but I know that you're deeply interested in the Philippines, is that on that day, Manila was also bombed, and suddenly Filipinos who had been working in the fields and leading labor actions and were treated pretty horribly in this country, in California, in the 20s and 30s, were our very best friends.
Right.
Because we all went to war together. So the war, World War II, I mean, I know that you're going to speak, and we'll talk about that in our next segment, you're going to speak about the turning point of World War I.
World War I, yes.
But we see in World War II, this beautiful community disrupted, fundamentally disrupted, by new policies that excluded the Japanese who had contributed so much.
Right.
Do you remember those years, the World War II years, Mr. Darrington? What do you recall about that?
My grandfather had some Japanese people that rented land from him at that time.
And they rented land because they under the Alien Land Act of 1913 could not buy land if they were aliens.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
But one of the saddest memories I have is watching them put all their personal belongings into trunks and to put them into storage while they had to go into intern camps and stuff like that. And
what was your feeling about that? Or
well,
did
you know,
you were a kid.
I was a kid, and they were talking about losing everything that they had accumulated. They put their car up on blocks, you know, and says, hopefully we'll be back to get it. And the houses that they built on the ranch for their own occupancy, you know, were going to be vacant and things like that. So it was a really sad time for those people, and it spread within the community as well for the rest of us to share those kind of feelings.
Because they were your friends and neighbors.
They were, yes.
And many of them lost their property forever. The war lasted 4 years, but it meant for many people who were interned that they lost everything and they had to start over. There was a great deal of hostility. In Salinas, a man who was of Chinese origin was shot on the street for being Japanese. Things like that happened in this country. So here you have this beautiful communal city that you remember that was being built up in the teens and 20s, with all of the investment from this new agricultural development. And then all of a sudden in 1945, we see everything kind of in reverse or collapsing. Is that the story, or did World War II do something more positive in that era?
Well, here's something
Pete?
interesting.
Okay.
See, I grew up going to elementary school in the 60s, and here's
Okay.
what I remember. I remember everybody regarding any Japanese American who had been in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Italy and southern France, and the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service, people who spoke Japanese. These were Japanese Americans, came from Salinas. When they came back, they were heroes. It was very interesting. One of the things that I found fascinating was that the Bataan Death March survivors, who had been totally abused by the Japanese, were very, very aware that there was no problem with the 442nd and the MIS veterans. So in a very real way, this was a chance for the Filipino Americans and the Japanese Americans to attain equality, because when the 60s came around, they were regarded as heroic and equal.
So for the one or two people who don't know this,
Right.
the 442nd was a regiment in the United States Army
Right.
that was entirely made up of Japanese people,
Right.
Japanese young men who chose
Right.
to leave the internment camps.
Right.
And one of the paths to citizenship for them, if they weren't already, there were many Japanese Americans interned who were already citizens.
Right.
In spite of that, they were still interned.
Right.
But one of the paths for their getting out was to join the army, and it was an issue that really tore apart families. But they performed. They were the most heroic
Absolutely.
fighters.
Yeah.
At the same time, Filipinos, who are now our partners during
Right.
World War II, are considered heroes too.
Right.
So in that sense, this communalism that you both remember was very real. And after the war ended, it even went up a notch. It was even more
To me, it was,
significant.
yeah.
It was even more significant. And it was after World War II, during World War II, the Bracero program is initiated, and we get another wave of immigrants.
Right.
And Salinas today reflects that new population of Mexican origin people
Right.
that goes back to the beginnings. This was
Right.
Mexico, right?
Right.
But this new population of Mexican origin people comes after that World War II moment. And when we talk about multiculturalism today, we're not referring to Japanese and Chinese settlement necessarily.
Right.
We're also referring to a new Mexican settlement. So the Salinas that we see today looks very different from the one you grew up in.
Yes.
It's less communal, perhaps.
Yes.
It's a lot bigger, 150,000 people
Versus 50 when I was a kid.
versus 50,000.
Versus 25 when you were a kid.
Versus like
Yeah, 28.
10,000.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we have a very, very different world that we're looking at. And we're also looking at something really important in terms of the city, and that is urban renewal, which hits in the 1960s and 70s. So we'll stop right there, and we'll pick up with your new efforts in the city, given the new reality that we're facing.
Good.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you.